I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Hilliard MacBeth, CEO of the MacBeth Group in Edmonton, and author of the book When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. Welcome to the show, Hilliard.
Hello, Jim.
How are things in Edmonton?
Well, actually right now I'm up at Whistler, and the ski hill is pretty good, but the visibility is kind of bad. But apparently it's going to be 18 degrees on Thursday and lots of sun. So, but in Edmonton, I think so far the recession has been pretty mild for Edmonton. I think it's quite a bit worse for Calgary because that's where most of the layoffs have been in Calgary. But certainly there are some signs in Edmonton of problems with housing prices, housing supply, layoffs. One of the things that's made people really upset in Edmonton a couple of weeks ago was the announcement that Edmonton didn't qualify for the accelerated unemployment rules, or I guess they're called employment insurance rules now. Calgary did, and lots of other parts of Canada did, but not Edmonton. Northern Alberta did, but not Edmonton, because Edmonton is protected to some degree by the government employment and University of Alberta and Grant MacEwan University. So, but I think it was a little bit unfair because around Edmonton, Nisku and all those surrounding areas, there's a huge employment to do with the oil sands, and that's starting to wind down. There's still one or two big plants that are under construction and expansions of existing plants, but once those are finished, I don't think there'll be any new oil sands plants built for quite a long time.
What's the view from where you are when it comes to housing prices in Toronto and Vancouver? Toronto set a record 5,000 sales in Greater Vancouver just in the month of March. Year to year, sales up 27%, prices up 23%. Toronto, first quarter, sales up 16%, a record for them. Apart from Vancouver and Toronto, the rest of the country probably a lot different. But how do you look at Vancouver and Toronto right now, where everybody says this is a bubble, it's bound to burst?
Well, I think that what's happened and it was happening all across Canada, but it seems to be less. Obviously in Alberta it's not happening anymore, but people are viewing a house more as an investment or a speculation than they are as a place to live. And as long as prices keep rising, that feeling intensifies. And then there's another feeling that comes in. The shorthand is FOMO, fear of missing out, and it's very powerful. So people feel they have to buy, even though it's $1 million or $2 million for a pretty modest home, or else they'll never be able to get in. Which is, it's happened so many times in the history of bubbles and the history of the world that feeling that everybody gets is leading us down the wrong path. And there's absolutely no necessity to get caught up in that, but people do. And the unflattering term for it is just simply greed, right? People can't stand the idea that somebody else is making money when they're not, so they have to jump in. But of course, what happens is there's no overall wealth created when house prices rise. This is the mistake that people make, is that thinking that this is new wealth. And I even see many prominent Canadian economists making this mistake, so it's quite interesting. There's no overall wealth created at all, because if you sold that house, say it went up by $1 million, you just have to buy another house which had gone up by $1 million. You're no further ahead. And it's a serious detriment to the new home buyer, the people that graduate from school and university, and then they go and they want to start a family and buy a home, and now it's out of reach. They obviously can't make it. So from the point of view of society as a whole, it's a negative when the real estate prices rise. It's not a positive. For a few individual older people, it may be a positive, but even they don't really get a chance to cash in on it because they're not going to sell and move to a trailer park or something. So it's a very disruptive thing, and you see in Vancouver and Toronto, I think a lot of comments now, especially in Vancouver, about how the local people are being completely blocked out of the housing market. But what they should remember is nobody's required to buy in any particular city. If you absolutely have to live in Vancouver, you can rent. And if you can't rent, then maybe Vancouver's not the place for you. But there's no necessity for anybody to buy a house in the middle of a real estate bubble like the one we're in. And this is a bubble of epic proportions. It's not just an ordinary mild bubble like the one the U.S. had. It's more like the one that Ireland had about 6 or 7 years ago. And there's still, millions of people in Ireland, and in Spain is another place that had it, that are paying for that. The interesting thing about Spain is you can't even walk away from the house and declare personal bankruptcy. They don't remove the debt just because a person declares personal bankruptcy. So nobody declares personal bankruptcy because there's no point. And they're still on the hook for these loans. I just talked to somebody from Spain recently, and they said that people move back in with their parents or with their grandparents, and they try and pay off these debts. It's just absolutely brutal what happens to people when the housing bubble bursts. And the idea that Vancouver is so special, or Toronto is so special, that all of these things that happened in Ireland, Spain, the United States, Iceland, would never happen here, that's just crazy thinking. It's insane thinking. It's delusional. But there's a lot of people caught up in it, and I can understand why. But all they have to do is just do a little bit of reading in history, read my book, and hopefully they'll get their feet back on the ground.
You said everybody fears being left out. I just saw an interview on TV. This woman's been offered a tremendous price for her house out in the burbs, but she's worried that I'll sell it and then I'll read in the paper that it is sold again for another $500,000 6 months later.
That's an interesting point you bring up, because when I was doing the research, it never occurred to me. But since then, I've realized there's a thing, and I've never seen it written anywhere, but I call it seller's greed. And that is somebody who's ready to sell, somebody who needs to sell, somebody has a reason to sell, but the thought of selling at $1.5 million and then watching it go to $2 million just is so difficult for them to accept. They just can't stand it. And that's another fear. That's another angle, I guess, on fear of missing out. But that's just greed. I mean, if somebody bought a house at $500,000 10 years ago and now it's worth $1.5 million, it would be obvious, I think, to anybody who was thinking straight that it was really nice to make $1 million profit. The guy that's buying it $1.5 million, people should have a little bit of sympathy for that person or that girl, and say, you know what, that's a risky thing to buy a house at $1.5 million when it was $500,000 not that long ago. I wish them luck, that if they can make another $500,000 on it, then good for them. They're taking a lot of risk. But I've got my profit. I'm happy. I don't have to care that somebody else is speculating on that home, because now we're totally into the realm of speculation. We're not in looking at houses as a place to live. Nobody can really use that amount of housing as just a place to live. We're now into housing as a way to make money, and it's a completely different thing. So if you're thinking about it as a way to make money, then it relates to the stock market, and people should be happy to sell with a really good profit and not worry at all if the person that's buying it, because every time somebody sells a stock, somebody's buying a stock. The person that's buying it is taking a lot more risk because they're paying triple what the seller pays, and they should wish them luck and say, well, good luck. I hope they do make some money. But I've had enough. I've got mine, and I've had enough, and it's always nice to give the next guy a chance.
What do you think of speculation taxes on people who buy homes? One of the suggested rules here would be you have to live in it for at least a year to avoid having to pay the transfer tax, whereas if you sell it within a year, you'll have to pay a speculation tax. Well,
I think that there's a bunch of problems with the exemption from capital gains tax for housing, but politically it's a real non-starter in terms of changing it. But the obvious way to change it would be to say that, if somebody's owned a house for 20 years, like even the rate of inflation over 20 years, the house is probably going to double in value. So you shouldn't have to pay tax on that. So somebody could work out the inflation numbers from the CPI and say, okay, if you've owned it this long and this is how much inflation is, that's tax-free, and anything beyond that would be taxable. For instance, from 1975 till 2014, the average house in Canada increased by fourfold. And if it had followed inflation, it would have increased by about 4 times. It actually increased by 8 times, but almost all of that extra increase was just in the last 10 years. So just calculate that. The Revenue Canada could easily do that, or the CRA, I should say, or CMHC could do it, and then anything above that would be taxable. I think that'd be a great idea. I don't know why there's a special. I can see why there would be an exemption for housing if people were buying houses just to live in, and it's for most people it's their biggest financial asset. But if people are buying them as investments or speculations, then it should be taxed as such. And I know in the U.S. they have a short-term gain versus long-term gain on capital gains. Maybe that's the way to go. The other way to go would be just simply to say, anybody that sells a home for any gain that somebody makes on a home up to $750,000 or maybe $850,000, which is a small business exemption you have on gains, is tax free for once in your life. That's it. And then anything above that, you pay regular tax on as if it were an investment. And that would make perfect sense. And 99.9% of the people would never get beyond the $850,000. And the people that did get beyond it, well, they should pay tax on it because those are the people that are speculating.
We'll have more with Hilliard MacBeth right after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Unbelievable harmony, spectacular performance, the ultimate tribute to the Everly Brothers and Simon & Garfunkel. Bird Dog and the Vintage Electric Band coming to Mission, White Rock, West Vancouver. Buy online and save at ontourtickets.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Hilliard MacBeth. Hilliard, one of the problems the high-tech sector has in Vancouver is attracting workers. Yes, Vancouver is a beautiful city. The offices that they have set up to work in are beautiful, but they can't afford the high housing prices. Rents in Vancouver are sky high, of course, because somebody has to own a building that cost a lot more than it did just a year ago. How do you get those workers to stay in Vancouver or even come here?
Well, I think in my own personal experience, having met some people that own high-tech companies in Vancouver, they're moving. One of them moved to Ireland, and other ones are thinking about moving elsewhere. Not quite sure where, because most high-tech companies can provide the support through the internet, and everybody knows about the people that are working in India and providing support on a computer you bought in Edmonton. So it's pretty standard in the high-tech industry. There's no real need. I did talk to one person recently in Vancouver saying there was a shortage of people. They couldn't find any people. And I said, well, there's lots of laid off people in Alberta that would be looking for a job. And it was interesting what he said. He said that the Alberta people are not employable in Vancouver because their expectations for wages are too high. Like, people in Alberta, up until recently, were used to getting a base of maybe $80,000 a year and then about another $30,000 or $40,000 in overtime. So, and they still haven't adjusted their expectations. So if you tried to make them move to Vancouver, offer them a much lower wage, and then force them to pay much higher costs for housing, it wouldn't work. So he said it's not going to, those people aren't available as a pool of people to move to Vancouver. Now, I know that in San Jose, California, there's a high tech, the Silicon Valley, and housing costs are pretty high there as well. So obviously, it's possible, but there's a lot of companies like Google and Apple and companies like that that are very interesting employers, and it's hard to compete with some of those companies, in terms of attracting the best employees. So I don't know what people do if they're desperate to live and work in Vancouver. Maybe they have to rent a room rather than a whole house. But people generally can find a way if they have to.
Plus, don't forget, in BC, you have to pay sales tax. In Alberta, you don't. Right there's another cost of living that perhaps they don't factor in.
I know that costs in Vancouver especially, and BC in general, are much higher than in Alberta. And for a long time, wages were quite a bit lower. So, and probably still are. So the lure of the ocean must be really powerful. Because I think we may have talked about this before, but the idea that the only way to be happy is to live in Vancouver is kind of crazy. In fact, there's a Nobel Prize winner that actually did a study on that and found that, and he was using California in the United States, and people had the belief that if they moved to California, they would be happier. But they did a study and they found out that people after an initial few weeks were just as unhappy or happy as they'd been in Indiana or wherever it is they moved from. So, and of course the other way to look at that is it's a crazy thought to say that everybody in Vancouver is happy and everybody who's not in Vancouver is unhappy. That doesn't make any sense at all. So I think people are as happy as they decide they're going to be, as to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln. And living in Vancouver is not really a factor. So I think in the long run, what will happen is the housing situation, like every bubble, will adjust. And unfortunately, in Vancouver, that means a pretty harsh adjustment, and a lot of people will be hurt, as is happening to some degree in other parts of Canada already.
Off to something maybe that's more entertaining or fun. Tesla. Those long lineups at Tesla dealerships across the country of people pre-registering to get the Tesla 3, the so-called affordable Tesla, $35,000. You own a Tesla or lease one. What is it like driving one of those beasts?
It's absolutely fantastic. It's as disruptive as any technology that I could possibly imagine. And I had a pretty nice car before. It was made by Mercedes-Benz, and the Tesla is another. It's like another universe. There's a lot of attention on Tesla in terms of it being electric, and that's a big factor. I plug it in at night at home, and most of the time, it's got a 400-kilometer range, and so I wouldn't have to plug it in for a week or 2 weeks. I don't know how long I could go without plugging it in, but they recommend that you plug it in every night anyway, so I do. And the electricity tops it up. And I've got it set to charge at midnight, because I know we don't have differential pricing in Alberta, but practically every other jurisdiction has differential pricing. There's lots of cheap electricity available between midnight and 8 a.m. So 99% of the charging is done at that time. But that's actually not the big thing about Tesla. The big thing about Tesla is it's a completely different driving experience. So you've got Autopilot, and you've also got a 17-inch screen, like a big iPad, you could think of it, and it controls the car. And even on my phone, I've got an app. Like right now, I'm in Whistler, but the car's back in Edmonton. I could check and see how the car's doing. I could charge it. I could turn it on. I could honk the horn. I could flash the lights. I could change the settings in it so that people couldn't drive it away, even if they had the key. And every night, the Tesla company upgrades the software if need be. I shouldn't say every night. Frequently, it'll go in and check the car and see how it's doing, and then if it needs any adjustments or software upgrades, it does that. But the big question about Tesla, of course, isn't what I'm talking about, which is their S-Class, which is their biggest version. It's this new car, which they are calling the 3, because Ford wouldn't let them call it the E. They wanted to call it the E, but Ford owns the rights to the Model E. They're suggesting that a couple of years from now they'll start rolling these off the assembly line in Fremont, California, and they might be able to produce up to 500,000 cars a year. I think 500,000 a year includes the 3 and the S and the X. So that's a big order, and there's definitely some question mark over whether they're going to actually be able to do it. It's all built in one factory. It was taken over from a factory that was abandoned in the financial crisis of 2009. The factory was owned by a joint venture between GM and Toyota. And of course they had to probably retool it and make it, because the Tesla is a very different car. But they feel they have the capacity to make 500,000 cars a year. That factory did have the capacity to make 500,000 cars a year under GM and Toyota. And of course, one of the big limiting factors is the batteries. So Tesla is also building in, I think, Nevada, a battery factory, which is going to make all the batteries for the car. But one of the big question marks is whether they can actually make money, because they've advertised $35,000 US as the starting price for this new car. But they're also saying that it's going to have all the features. So I don't know about that. That's going to be really interesting. The battery alone is very expensive, and it's a question mark as to whether they're going to be able to pull it off. And I don't know. The stock, they announced last night that that they had failed to meet their sales targets, or not sales targets. They don't have any problem with sales. They got a backlog of orders. It's production is the problem. They failed to meet their production targets in the 3 months to the end of March by a small miss, but a miss. So they're confident in the future they're going to be able to ramp up the production, but it's a complicated car to make, and I suspect there are going to be a few hiccups. So when I first started looking at this in February, the stock was trading at about $160 US, and a couple of days before this latest announcement, it was up to $250. So it was a 50% increase in just a month, or a little bit over a month. And so we'll see if it maybe sells off a bit, because it might be a tremendous investment too. I haven't bought the stock. I bought the car, but I haven't bought the stock. But I'm certainly looking at it, and I'm very interested, because, as I said at the beginning, my sense is it's disruptive. I think it's going to be a huge game changer for the car industry.
What's it like to drive in cold and bad weather? I've heard that's one of the knocks against electric cars.
There was one snowstorm after I took delivery of the car. It was, the roads in Edmonton were, snowy and icy. And one of the things I didn't mention about this car, which probably everybody knows, is that it's got tremendous acceleration. It's got this ludicrous mode that you've heard about. Maybe if you haven't heard about it, check it out on YouTube, which accelerates the car very rapidly, like a Ferrari kind of thing. And so I thought, well, I better not do that, because there's snow and ice all over the road. So I didn't do that. But I tried to give it lots of power, and it with all-wheel drive, 2 motors, one on each axle, and a computer controlling everything, I was unable to get it to slip or slide. It was fine. And of course, like all cars in Edmonton, generally you tend to put winter tires on in the winter, and it had that. So that part is fine. The other question mark was the battery. So does it use more energy? Well, if you have more heat on, obviously it's going to use more energy. And I've seen estimates as high as 25%. So that would mean the 430-kilometer range that I was talking about would be reduced by 25%, which maybe would get you down to by about 100 kilometers, so say 300 kilometers. For day-to-day operation, that wouldn't be a problem at all. Like, I'm never going to go even 100 kilometers in a day around Edmonton. For traveling on the highway, they have these superchargers about every 150, 200 kilometers if I wanted to go from Edmonton to Vancouver. So I would just stop, charge up. And the nice thing about electric cars is you plug it into the charger and you go inside and have a coffee. You don't have to stand out there in the cold and keep your hand on the nozzle as the gasoline flows in. And then the app on your phone will tell you when it's fully charged. So I don't think that's going to be a problem, but I have heard that from a lot of people. I've heard about range anxiety. I've heard about cold weather. And of course, one person said to me, well, yeah, but all of the energy in Alberta is created by coal-fired plants, which is not quite right, but it is about 60%. It's the last province in Canada that uses coal to a large degree. Maybe the only province left that uses coal, because Ontario got rid of all their coal in 2014. So that is a problem if you bought it for the purpose of making the planet a better place and saving the planet, that sort of thing. But the Alberta government has announced that they're going to phase out coal by 2020 or something like that. So those are some of the issues. But no, there haven't been any issues that I've heard about or read about so far that would really be something that would stop the onslaught of this technology. This is groundbreaking technology, and if they can pull it off, it'll make a big difference to the economy and, of course, to the car manufacturers especially.
Do you feel safer when you drive the Tesla?
Well, it's got autopilot, right? So one of the things that takes some getting used to is you set it at a speed. You can do this in the city or in the highway, and then it'll adjust to the cars around it. So it's got sonar and radar and all kinds of sensors. So if there's a car in front of it that's going slower, it'll slow down, and then it'll speed back up as the road clears up. It'll speed back up to the speed limit again. There's an interesting thing I discovered. They have the speed limit in the Autopilot. They have the speed limits of everywhere, like probably in the world. I don't know, and if you try to set the Autopilot too high, it'll allow you to go a bit over the speed limit, but it doesn't allow you to go very far over the speed limit. But it does take a bit of getting used to, because when the car in front of you is stopped, you're coming up to the red light and there's a car there. Most of us would probably take our foot off the power, half a block back, but the Tesla waits until closer to the car, and then it slows down. So you sort of go, I hope it sees that car. I hope it sees that car. But it does. Then you can see on the screen that there's a car. It's got all the cars around you displayed on the screen, so you can see that it knows that there's a car there, and you just have to believe that it's going to. But certainly, I think it is a lot safer for that reason. And if for some reason I fell asleep or something like that, it would do an emergency stop anyway. So it's not going to wait for me to, and then it would shut off the Autopilot, shut off the car until I woke up again, I guess. So, for people that are distracted driving or like sending a text or something, it would be much safer. And in fact, Warren Buffett has written something about this, not necessarily about the Tesla, but about the autonomous driving movement. Saying that it could really affect, because one of Warren Buffett's biggest holdings is Geico, the insurance company, with the little lizard, and he's written a piece which I haven't studied it carefully yet, so I can't really say, but apparently he's quite concerned about the effect that'll have on the insurance premiums, because people stop having accidents because of autonomous cars, then they're not going to be needing to have expensive insurance anymore.
So a break for the insurance company and for the individual.
Well, it would lower the cost of driving for sure, and then of course, the people that get killed on the road. I mean, everybody worries about ISIS, but the numbers, when you look at the numbers, the people that get killed on the highways in North America are vastly larger amounts of people than anybody that's unfortunate enough to get caught in a terrorist attack. Although I know that that's a terrible thing, but the numbers are completely different, and.
Yes, so more Canadians are killed by moose every year than ISIS could imagine.
Yeah, I wonder how the Tesla would do, because it's funny you should mention moose. I was once in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, and I had to go to Moncton, New Brunswick, and it was the evening. I had to drive in the evening, which I wouldn't recommend. It's a very lonely road. And I'm driving along, and all these little eyes are staring back from the ditch, and it was quite spooky, and especially when I realized these are all moose, and these are just the ones you could see. Literally, there was several every kilometer, it seemed like, in some stretches. I just holding my breath that one of them didn't run out in front of us. So I slowed down, but that's the most dangerous thing you can probably run into in Canada, for sure.
Hilliard, thank you very much for chatting with us and sharing your experience with the Tesla.
It's nice to talk to you, Jim.
My guest has been Hilliard MacBeth, CEO of the MacBethGroup.com in Edmonton and author of the book When the Bubble Bursts, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. You can forward comments or questions to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.